So it is time for the press preview. It's our first look at what is on tomorrow's front pages. And tonight we'll have a look at those front pages with the journalist and author, Christina Pattison, who's joined by the political editor of the Scottish Sun, Rachel Watson. A very good evening to both of you. We'll speak to them in a moment, but first of all, let's have a look at those front pages for you, beginning with the Sunday Times. I'm the PM who will get Brexit done, says Sunak. The paper leads with those defiant words by the Prime Minister. Sunak snubs Johnson over new Brexit deal. The Sunday Telegraph focusing on the showdown with his former boss. The Daily Mirror leads with a plea to Rishi Sunak by a Ukrainian boy to be reunited with his father in the UK amid a backlog of thousands in the government's Homes for Ukraine scheme. Let's bring in your Sunday Express, reporting on ministers planning to crack down on lawyers representing migrants in asylum claims. While figures obtained by The Observer suggest around 1 in every 100 police officers in England and Wales faced criminal charges last year. And on the front page of The Star, a story that Satanist groups are holding bake-off contests in a bid to attract more members. And don't forget, you can scan that QR code that you see on screen during the programme. Check out the front pages of the papers while you watch us discussing them. And to discuss them, journalist and author Christina Pattison and political editor of the Scottish Sun, Rachel Watson. Right, let's get cracking, shall we? Christina, why don't you kick things off? Lots of talk about a potential Brexit deal being imminent, maybe tomorrow, maybe Monday. If things go according to the Prime Minister's plan. The Sunday Times has had an interview with him, and he says, I'm the PM who will get Brexit done, in something of a dig, I guess, to one of his predecessors.
Yes, well, I think the thing about Rishi Sunak is that he is rather more of a realist than his predecessor, who seemed to think that things could just be done through pure fantasy and willpower. Not his willpower, obviously, but his mental willpower. So he thought that you could have a deal, a Brexit deal that meant that the Northern Ireland could maintain sovereignty and there could be no border with the EU. And clearly he was living in cloud cuckoo land, and that was quickly proven to be the case. And he actually promised people in Northern Ireland there would be no checks on goods and there would be no border anywhere, which obviously was a promise he couldn't make, which he then broke. So Rishi Sunak has been left with this problem along with millions of other problems, and he has been sitting down with Ursula Leyen and various other EU sort of, the kind of people wielding the power and in a position to do the negotiating in the EU. And it looks as though he has managed to secure a deal that ticks most of the boxes, in that Northern Ireland will maintain sovereignty and there will be relatively few checks on goods. Those going destined for Ireland, it seems, will have to have some checks because Ireland is part of the EU. But it looks as though there will be expedited lanes for goods destined for supermarkets in Northern Ireland, which should make things much easier. And needless to say, the usual people who froth at the mouth, the ERG, the DUP, and Boris Johnson, who just enjoys frothing at the mouth because it's what makes him happy to draw attention to himself, are going mad. And Boris Johnson is harbouring fantasies of using this as a way back into number 10, and hopes that he can bring some kind of face-off with Rishi Sunak, which I don't think will happen. I'm sure there'll be some kind of row, but I don't think Boris Johnson will get back to number 10, and I don't think the country wants him back in power. So I suspect this will pass. Labour have said they will support it, and that will be a victory for Sunak, and well done for him for grappling with reality and not this kind of parallel universe that we've been living in for the last few years.
OK, certainly that interview in the Times, Rachel, is very defiant by the Prime Minister. But do you think this agreement will be accepted by the DUP? It's also, as Christina was saying, it's going to need the backing of those Tory backbenchers in the ERG.
Yeah, there are so many problems for Rishi Sunak here. Just getting a deal is the first step, and then getting it through, getting the support behind it is step 2. And I think that's why we've seen, if you look at the Sunday Times interview, there's words from the Prime Minister also in the Telegraph, really a move by Rishi Sunak to try and get ahead, get one foot out in front of people like Boris Johnson and others who might be planning a rebellion. The Telegraph mentioned that Steve Baker might be on resignation watch at the moment over this. They mention some other names as well, warnings of civil war within the party. And they do mention again DUP and the fact that there are concerns that if the DUP don't back this, then they won't go to Stormont and have those negotiations about power sharing. And that is a huge problem for Rishi Sunak. There's a huge, it will be a huge coup if he manages to get this deal and then get it through. Boris Johnson is not his only predecessor who has had huge problems in negotiating some kind of deal over Northern Ireland. Since the Brexit vote, we've had Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and now Rishi Sunak trying to get somewhere with this. Liz Truss obviously didn't have very much time at all to do anything, but a number of prime ministers who try and work over this. And I think this is a clear move by the prime minister to try and get in front of those people and say to them, if you look at some of the words used by Rishi Sunak, that he believes in Brexit, he campaigned for Brexit, he voted for Brexit, and he wants to see this go through. But he also talks about the people in Northern Ireland, businesses in Northern Ireland who need a deal. And he's trying to make that appeal to his colleagues, to the DUP, and to the wider population who voted for Brexit, that actually, the promises that were made before, as Christina mentioned, were not deliverable by the UK government, and this is. And this will hopefully go some way to solving those problems. And it's a real move by the Prime Minister to try and get that out before people like Boris Johnson and Steve Baker and other people who might be unhappy with this can then go back out and brief against him in this deal.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point you make there, isn't it, Christina? And something that stood out for me in that interview in the Sunday Times was when Rishi Sunak said about the awful shooting that happened recently, sort of reminding us, he said, of the delicate situation in Northern Ireland, the fragility of it, and we shouldn't take it for granted. There is a huge amount resting on this. There's a lot of talk about sausages and all the rest of it, but actually there's so much more to this, which means that it has to work.
Absolutely. And that's why it was so utterly immoral for Boris Johnson to use this really as a plaything, as a way for him to bolster his power and his image and to be a kind of ostensibly a hardliner on Brexit and then betray absolutely everybody involved, because people died and somebody nearly died this week in that killing. I mean, I think to take so lightly what was actually a war, a civil war in Northern Ireland. I mean, I grew up in Guildford. I remember the pub bombings in Guildford. These were real atrocities that happened. We lived in fear of them, even in London, in the mainland, and that was not very long ago. And as Joe Biden has made very clear, the most important thing has been to preserve peace in Northern Ireland and indeed here, because the lack of peace had ramifications here. And they took that, the Tories have taken that very, very lightly. So I don't think Rishi Sunak is the best person at the politics in terms of handling the DUP or the ERG, though I do think the ERG and the DUP, for that matter, are pretty impossible to handle because they're just not terribly rational about these things. But I do think he understands, the kind of real life ramifications in a way that those people tend not to. So I have to say, let's give credit where it's due.
OK, well, let's see what happens in the next 48 hours. I just want to move on before the break, Rachel, to a story in The Observer, which the paper is saying insiders have told them that the Labour Party is now debt and deficit free after this £2 million donation.
Yeah, this is a kind of positive weekend for Labour. If you look at some of the headlines that are being generated by them, as you say, this piece in The Observer, they say that David Sainsbury has donated £2 million to the party, which not only that £2 million is a huge boost to the party finances when we've got a general election year coming up, even though we're only at the start of 2023, minds are very much on that next general election. But also, this is a business boss who's come in and is backing the Labour Party with a substantial donation, something that they will want to do. And there's a huge belief within Labour in Scotland and the rest of the UK that they will be the next government, that they will win the next election. We're still, a bit out from that general election, but they've got the belief there. and that's what they want to do. And there's concern within the Conservatives, and there'll be more concern when they see the fact that business now is looking to the Labour Party, giving these donations, but also those other headlines this weekend that I mentioned with Luciana Berger joining the Labour Party again. She obviously left under Jeremy Corbyn around the time when there was rows within the Labour Party about anti-Semitism, and having her back is very symbolic for the Labour Party and Sir Keir Starmer, and really does give them that boost that the party is moving on from those fractures that really divided the party and really took all that, that's what we were talking about Labour for so many years. For months, we were talking about those divisions, the problems they had within the party, the internal struggle. And now we're talking about these huge donations, backing from business, and the fact that Sir Keir Starmer and others in the party have that belief that they will win the next general election.
Christina?
Yeah, you can almost feel the tectonic plates shifting. Sir Keir Starmer, when he spoke this week about his 5 goals for Labour, he had that sheen of power. He looked like a prime minister. I think he's beginning to feel like a prime minister in waiting, and the fact that business are flocking to Labour says everything, really. And who can blame them? Because Brexit and the Tories have been absolutely disastrous for business. And when Boris Johnson,
Christina, by those 5 missions, was there enough detail there for you?
Well, look, he's not going to give great detail at this point because he doesn't know what money will be available. And also, he doesn't want his policies to be nicked by the Tories, as frequently happens when Labour comes up with good ideas. So his job now is to seem electable, and he's doing a pretty good job at that. And I think his detoxifying of Labour over anti-Semitism and in refusing Jeremy Corbyn being able to run again, I think all of this is beginning to have the effect that the electorate are trusting him, and all of that is absolutely vital. So I think he's doing well, and I think that as things look at the moment, they will win the next election, and thank goodness for that.
Hello again. Part 2 of the press preview with Rachel and Christina. Rachel, a couple of very interesting and quite disturbing stories, actually, regarding the police and crime. One on the front of The Observer, one on the front of the Sunday Times. The Observer saying that 1 in 100 police faced criminal charges in 2022, which is remarkable, isn't it? Let's talk about that one first, then we'll go on to the one in the Times.
Yeah, as you say, a really remarkable story. The figures on it are so stark, and it's another one of these stories that are becoming really, we're seeing them a lot at the moment. There's been stories in Scotland as well about that confidence in the police and how much confidence can people have in the police at the moment. So this story is that 1,387 claims were made to the Police Federation for legal support for criminal charges. Now, we don't know, we've only seen the bit on the front of the paper, on the front of the Observer, so we don't know the severity of these charges. There's no detail what they are, but it does talk about a near 600% rise in 10 years in these claims for support. And I think it feeds into this, as I said, this talk over the last couple of years about the confidence we can have in the police. There's been such high-profile cases. We remember the Sarah Everard case, which was a really horrific example of police and a really horrific case there that happened with a serving police officer. And there's been other cases, not to that severity, but that really called into question the culture within police and the vetting, because we know that the majority of officers obviously go out there and serve and do their job to protect people. But there have been questions around the vetting and the culture within police that these cases that they even occur, let alone the fact that we don't hear about them until it's often that they're going through court, and these people are still serving police officers.
Yeah, I mean, Christina, regardless of the severity of the charges, it's still a desperately worrying figure.
It's absolutely horrific, really horrific. And one of the really worrying things about this story, and I have to say I've had this sense before, is that the Police Federation, which is like the sort of the union of the police, except that you automatically join the Police Federation when you become a police person, there seems to be a sense that they are have essentially been supporting police almost irrespective of whether they, that the bias has been towards supporting police, let's say, rather than supporting the law, which is pretty shocking. And if you found 1% of any workforce to have committed a criminal act, that would be pretty shocking. But for the police, I have to say, I have the sense at the moment that faith in the police to protect people is at something like an all-time low. And the general sense actually in this country at the moment is that all our public services are failing us for different reasons. But the sense of corruption and criminality and sexism and misogyny and violence endemic in the police force has absolutely ruptured faith in the police, particularly for women, in a way that it'd be very hard for them to come back from. So it's deeply, deeply shocking.
Yeah, and I did mention a second story as well. It's on the front of the Sunday Times, Rachel. This is about low-level crime and police failing to charge any suspects.
Yeah, so the Sunday Times have figures on reports of public threats, abuse or harassment. And they say that just 3% of these led to someone being charged. And again, it feeds into what Christine and I were just talking about public confidence in police and this wider conversation about public services and what is happening there. And, people will read this story and be questioning the legal system. If you are the victim of a crime, you want to make sure you want that to be dealt with, charges to be brought, and to see that go through court. But it seems here that, again, can people really depend on that at the moment?
OK, and let's finish with the front of the Telegraph, Christina. Now, we've heard a lot, haven't we, in the last few days about Roald Dahl books and changes being made to them to suit, perhaps, the sensitivities of current readers. Now, James Bond books are being edited.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm a bit, as a Californian would say, conflicted on this one. I thought the Roald Dahl, I didn't approve of that. I think, for goodness sake, you can't keep rewriting writers. We're all products of our time. Culture changes all the time. In 25 years, culture will have changed again, and most of the things many of the things we regard as sort of, deeply politically correct now will be deemed completely, sort of outrageous in 25 years' time. But having looked at the recommendations for the James Bonds, which are largely to do with racism or kind of almost pornographic sexism, I sort of feel, OK, James Bond is sort of a franchise, and the films themselves have changed a lot over the years. So, I remember watching James Bond films as a child, and they would be absolutely unacceptable in terms of political correctness today. So I kind of understand why these changes have been made, but I think it's a slippery slope. Are we going to start censoring Shakespeare and Jane Austen and certainly the sense amongst some youngsters, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way to them, but again, to do with cultural shifts, is that everything has to be kind of edited, censored, full of trigger warnings. And actually, we just have to be, in many ways, more comfortable with reading stuff that we don't necessarily agree with. Okay. But I think stuff, James Bond, stuff that really fosters ugly racism, I can absolutely see why people felt it was necessary to make some minor changes there.
Yeah. And a very quick thought, Rachel, on this, 20 seconds.
Yeah, I agree completely with that as well. I think the language, when you read the article and the language that is being used and suggested to change, you can see there's these questions over whether, will people continue to read these books if you don't make that change? What will the thoughts on those be? So I think, it is a slippery slope. There's a wider discussion to be had on where that line lies too.